My name again is Vishal Sachdev. I'm the director of the Illinois Maker Lab and a faculty who's teaching one of the courses on our 3D printing specialization on Coursera. And this webinar is sort of a monthly part of our monthly series where we bring in experts in the area of 3D printing. And we have today John Hornick, who's one of our speakers actually in the course as well. And we've interviewed him a couple of times to get his expertise, to get his thoughts on, intellectual property, and particularly in the context of 3D printing. So we also have Dr. Eric Reinfleisch, who's another faculty in the course, who's joining in, and he'll be here with us shortly as well. So for those of you who are not already in the course, a little brief overview. This specialization is a collection of courses, starting with the course by Dr. Eric Reinfleisch on why 3D printing is a revolution, followed by my course on where we explore 3D printing applications. And in that course, we have an overview of IP issues in the context of 3D printing with John Hornick here. After that, you learn the software, some design skills using some software, and that was co-produced with Autodesk. So you're learning Tinkercad and Fusion as a software, and then also scanning. After that, we have the hardware course, which is pending launch, that is being prepared, and then followed by a capstone. So if you haven't already checked out the course, please do check that out. You can find more information about us on 3dprintingprofs.com. Now, before I sort of introduce John, a little bit about how we'll run the webinar. So as you're all joining, you can use the chat to introduce yourself. So tell us where you're from. Are you already in the course? What is your interest in 3D printing? And sort of get to know each other on the webinar. And you'll see the chat option in the bottom panel in the Zoom window. So this webinar is also being live streamed on YouTube and on we have an internal sort of platform with our online MBA students as well, and we are streaming this webinar to them as well. So let me just check if, yes, we have Eric Reinfleisch who's joined. So let me see if I can get him in. Morning, Eric.
Morning, Vishal.
Morning, how are you? I've just done some overview and introductions of the 3D printing online specialization. I was just going to move into introducing John, but I guess I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day here in the heartland of America, Champaign, Illinois, broadcasting live and in person. Pleased to, well, Vishal, should I introduce our guest speaker?
Please do.
Okay. Well, we're pleased as members of the 3D printing community to have one of the rock stars in this domain, the Honorable John Hornick, Esquire. Maybe not honorable yet, right, John? John's not a federal judge yet. but he is an attorney. And John is the world's foremost authority in terms of the legal implications of 3D printing, especially desktop 3D printing. And he is also the author of this fantastic book, which I think is the best book today on the topic of 3D printing, called 3D Printing Will Rock the World, which you can find on Amazon. And there is a nice chapter here in this book about this topic, although I'm sure we'll learn much more from John. So John, that's a bit of introduction. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers about yourself and what you do?
Well, thanks, Eric. Well, I'll just say a little bit about that as I go on.
Okay. Now, as some of you may know, the topic of 3D printing has received a lot of attention recently in terms of the concern about 3D printed guns. So I wonder if John could start off a bit about talking what is a 3D printed gun, and how does one make one? Is that actually a thing that people can do?
Well, I'm going to talk a lot about the details of that, but basically, starting in 2012, there was one very simple 3D printed gun, and that's the one that all the news is about. But as I'm going to show you in this presentation, there are a whole lot more 3D printed guns and accessories out there, and they're far more sophisticated than the one that's getting all the media attention. How do you do it? Well, it depends on what you want to make, but the one that's getting all the media attention was made with a machine that cost about $25,000 new. So it's not just a machine that you buy for a few $100s that makes Yoda heads. That's what everybody thinks 3D printers do, I think. And I'll show you also a machine, a gun that was made with out of metal, out of a machine that cost probably about $1 million. So although they can be 3D printed by just about anyone, you have to have the right equipment.
Okay. So as far as I know, John, no one yet has been shot with a 3D printed gun. Is that a correct statement?
I believe that is correct. I think that there have been some 3D printed guns and gun parts that have been seized in police raids in various places around the world. But so far, I don't think any of them have actually been used to commit a crime.
So in Chicago, unfortunately, just up the road, we have about anywhere from 50 to 100 shootings a weekend. And I believe none of them happen with 3D printed guns.
Well, not that we know of. I mean, as I'll talk about as I go on, we only know what we know. If there was one that was used in a crime, we'd only know that if the person had gotten caught with it. But so far in the news, I haven't seen any reports of a 3D printed weapon being used in a crime.
Okay. And John, you have a presentation for us today?
Yes, I do. Shall I start?
Sure.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. That was a great introduction, and thanks, Vishal, for having me. As Eric said, a few years ago, I wrote this book, 3D Printing Will Rock the World. And since then, I've been asked to do some consulting in the law enforcement industry about how 3D printing can be used either to benefit law enforcement or how it can be used by the bad guys. And today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 3D printed guns and the panic and the misinformation that has been surrounding them well, for several years now, but especially within the last 2 months because of some developments in the Cody Wilson Defense Distributed case. Now, you're going to I have some opinions on this, which I'll express as I go along. I'm sure you'll all form your own opinions, and they may be different by the end than they are now. I'm not going to talk today about what 3D printing is. That's a whole separate topic. I have some YouTube videos on that. If you search for my name and 3D printing, you'll find those videos. I have one that goes into great detail about what the technology is. It's the full range of the technology and the cost of the machines on both the consumer and the professional side. Now let's start with Cody Wilson and Defense Distributed. Cody's gotten a lot of media attention since 2013. And I want you to understand that almost everything that I'm talking about today and his lawsuits and the real relevance here is about digital blueprints. Some people call them CAD files, some people call them digital models. I call them digital blueprints. And that's really what all of this is about. Now, in late 2012, and the time is important here, late 2012, which was almost 6 years ago, Cody Wilson and his nonprofit organization called Defense Distributed published the 3D printable blueprints for the gun that you see in the upper left-hand corner, which is called the Liberator. It's a single shot, 38 caliber pistol. It is not undetectable. It contains a hunk of metal so that it is detectable under the Undetectable Firearms Act. Cody Wilson complied with the law when he made this pistol. Now, some people say, well, you could 3D print and leave out that chunk of metal. That is true, but it also has a metal firing pin. Metal firing pin is detectable, and it would be difficult to make this weapon or any weapon really without metal firing pin. He also posted digital blueprints for what you see in the lower left-hand corner. That is the lower receiver of an AR-15 weapon. Now, the lower receiver part is not the black grips, and it's not the magazine that you see sticking out the bottom of it. It's just the other part. It's kind of a whitish as opposed to bluish That's the lower receiver. He posted the digital blueprints for that component. On the right side, you see the magazine that's sticking out of the bottom of the lower receiver. That is the digital blueprints for that were also posted in late 2012. And all of these components that you see here and the weapon, they're made of plastic. Okay. Now, then we move forward into 2013 when the US State Department sent a letter to Defense Distributed saying that the dissemination of those blueprints over the internet violated something called ITAR. That's the International Trade and I'm drawing a blank at the moment. But anyway, the International Trade and Arms Regulations. And the purpose of those regulations is to prevent the spread of military equipment, or sometimes people commonly say weapons of war. So after Defense Distributed received this letter in 2013, they took down those digital blueprints from the internet. And at least they took them down from their own website, and that's important. I'll talk about that as I go on. But before they were taken down, they were downloaded at least 100,000 times. And that was in 2013, actually 2012 and 2013. And those downloads, I'm sure, have been widely disseminated, not way, way beyond the original 100,000 downloads. Now, as a result of getting this letter and being forced to take down those digital blueprints, Defense Distributed sued the State Department. And the question there was, can the government block the distribution of these digital blueprints over the internet? And they argued that blocking them violated the First Amendment. They called the publication of these blueprints a form of speech, and therefore they say it violated the First Amendment. And they also said it violated the Second Amendment. And now I'm not going to form any opinions about what's right and wrong here. I'm only going to talk about what is possible under the law as it exists. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go on. Now, that was 2013. Fast forward to June of 2018, Defense Distributed and the State Department settled that lawsuit. And the State Department concluded, as I knew they would, that ITAR doesn't apply to these blueprints, and that's important. Now, I think if the case had actually gone to trial, the court probably would have reached the same result. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as to why that is. Now, the settlement allowed those digital blueprints to be reposted on the internet beginning on August 1st of this year. And since the original takedown back in 2013, Defense Distributed has developed some other blueprints. And some of those are 3D printable and some are not. And I'll make that distinction as we go forward here. But the settlement would have allowed not only the 2013 blueprints to be reposted, but also these new ones as well. Now, although they weren't supposed to be reposted until August 1st, they actually reappeared on the Defense Distributed website on July 27th, and they were downloaded at least 2,500 times before what I'll call the second takedown, which I'll get to in a second. Now, a couple days later, the panic began. The attorneys general in a bunch of the US states panicked. It started with the Washington State Attorney General, and they filed a lawsuit against the State Department. A bunch of the other states joined in that lawsuit, which was in Seattle in federal court. And that resulted in what I call the second takedown. Defense Distributed took down those digital blueprints from their website around the very beginning of August. Now, the case in the Seattle court is mostly procedural mumbo jumbo. It's mostly all these complicated procedural arguments. Basically, they're arguing that the State Department didn't jump through enough hoops before they entered into this settlement with Defense Distributed. And that's important. I'll get back to that in a minute. At the end of August, the court issued an injunction and said that essentially the State Department couldn't go forward with the settlement. Interestingly, that injunction didn't order Defense Distributed to do anything. It only ordered the State Department not to go forward with the settlement. However, Defense Distributed took down the blueprints anyway. And now that injunction is immediately appealable to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is covers the West Coast, basically, covers California and Washington and Oregon. So that'll happen fairly soon, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But basically, that could be overturned. And what's interesting, I think, is that the court, the Seattle federal court, assumed there was a First Amendment violation. So kind of validated this idea that publishing the digital blueprints is a form of speech. And the quote from the court is on the right-hand side, where the court says, the court declines to wade through these issues based on the limited record before it, and instead presumes that the private defendants, that's Defense Distributed, had a First Amendment right to disseminate the CAD files. Now, there was also another lawsuit filed in federal court in Pennsylvania. And in that court, Defense Distributed voluntarily agreed to take down the blueprints from being available in Pennsylvania. Now, anybody who's familiar with the internet knows that that kind of an action is kind of like saying, clouds won't fly over the state, right? So now what's important about this lawsuit and the current result with the injunction is that Defense Distributed's digital blueprints were always available on the internet. Even though Defense Distributed took them down in 2013, they've been available on the internet and on other websites the entire time. They've also been available on the dark web the entire time. And starting at the end of July of this year, they also were posted on a website called codeisfreespeech.com. Now, most people think this was Cody Wilson's website. I actually haven't seen anything that shows that. What I think it is a group of sympathizers who immediately took the files either from Cody Wilson's website when they were reposted on July 27th, or from the internet, because they've been there the entire time since 2012. And put them up on this website that they call codeisfreespeech.com, and they're still there right now. Now, these lawsuits, I think, could turn out to have unintended consequences because, the state's attorneys general think they're going to win. But these lawsuits will be forums to decide whether the First and the Second Amendment apply to whether digital blueprints can be posted, and possibly also to whether it is okay to 3D print from those digital blueprints. Also, Philadelphia enacted a law a few years ago that made it illegal to 3D print guns. And that law may also get tested in these lawsuits indirectly. And who knows, the result could be that law is declared unconstitutional, and it could be found that it's constitutional to disseminate these blueprints. Now, I think that the State Department will eventually win, either because they win on the merits of the case. In other words, court says, you've been right on the law all along. ITAR does not apply to these blueprints. I think that will be the ultimate outcome. Also, as I said, the case is based upon procedural mumbo jumbo, basically saying that the State Department didn't jump through the right hoops before entering into the settlement. Well, all they need to do is jump through those hoops. And once they've jumped through them, those procedural arguments that the state's attorneys general have made, they just drop away. They won't exist once the State Department does what the attorneys generals are saying they should have done before they entered into the settlement. And I think ultimately the settlement will be upheld. Now, also the legislators started to panic around this beginning of August of this year. And there has been federal legislation introduced to block the online dissemination of 3D printable digital blueprints. I think, again, this law, if it's ever enacted, will be tested under the First and Second Amendments. But more importantly, I think even if such a law is enacted that says you can't disseminate 3D printable blueprints online, I think it's inherently unenforceable. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail as I go on. The states also started to get on the bandwagon and are talking about it, introducing their own legislation, either to ban the dissemination of 3D printable blueprints online or to ban the 3D printing of guns. And this is important. It's important to understand what that means because, you know, in this country, it's perfectly legal to make a gun in your garage. Perfectly legal. It has to be detectable. But as long as it's detectable, it's perfectly legal to make any kind of a non-automatic weapon. Now let's go back to whether, I said I think ultimately the court will decide that these digital blueprints don't fall under ITAR, and here's why. Remember, ITAR is to prevent the dissemination of military equipment or weapons of war. Now, if you look at this pistol, I wouldn't want to go to war with this pistol. I mean, I'd feel much more comfortable with some other weapon, okay? It's a 38 caliber single shot plastic weapon. And it's, as I said before, it's fully detectable. This AR-15 lower receiver in the lower right-hand corner, it's only a component of the weapon, okay? So it's not a weapon of war, it's a component of a weapon of war. And the same thing with the magazine. It's just a component of, I'm sorry, it's not a weapon of war at all, because I'll get to that in a second, but it's just a component of a weapon, both of these things, the lower receiver and the magazine. Now, in the settlement, the State Department said non-automatic firearms less than 50 caliber are not weapons of war. They do not fall under ITAR, okay? And AR weapons are less than 50 caliber. So regardless of what the state's attorneys general argue, regardless of what the courts might feel from a political standpoint, a lot of political pressure around this issue, the question is, do they fall under ITAR? And they simply don't, because the State Department is making decisions here about what ITAR means on a much broader scale. It's not looking at this particular case. It's looking at how are we going to enforce these regulations across all weaponry, okay? So they've made a cutoff. Anything less than 50 caliber is not considered a weapon of war under ITAR. Now, you might say, yeah, this is a weapon of war, but it's not a weapon of war under ITAR. And that's the distinction, that's the law, and that's what's going to govern this case, not politics and not emotions or anything else. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the courts or anybody else to unring this bell that the State Department rang when they said that non-automatic firearms less than 50 caliber are not weapons of war. Now, what are the big issues here? The big issues are, can or should anything be done about the dissemination of blueprints like this online? And more importantly, I think, would it be effective if you did try to do anything? My personal opinion is that nothing can stop the dissemination of digital blueprints over the internet. Nothing can stop the 3D printing of guns, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Also, I think it's totally too late to do anything about this, because these digital blueprints for at least Defense Distributed weapons, they've been available online since 2012. They've been widely disseminated since that time. But more importantly, Cody Wilson was never alone. Defense Distributed was never alone. There are plenty of other people out there who are 3D printing weapons, who are disseminating the blueprints for them. And that's been happening since 2012. Now, you can enact a law or a regulation that makes it illegal to 3D print a weapon or to disseminate these blueprints. But it's really just a mechanism for punishment. It doesn't stop these things from happening. Just like you have a law against murder, it doesn't stop murder from happening. It just gives you a mechanism to punish people if they're caught doing it. And that's all that's going to happen here. If we have any new laws, they'll just be mechanisms for punishment if people happen to get caught. Now, let's start with what the misinformation is that's circulating around about this out there, and there's a lot of it. One is that the Pennsylvania Attorney General said that the blocked 3D printable blueprints are for an entire AR-15. He said that the blocked blueprints are for an entire AR-15. Not true. AR-15s cannot be printed all in plastic. The barrel has to be metal. Firing mechanism has to be metal. But as I mentioned before, it's totally legal to make an AR-15 weapon in this country. So what we're talking about here is whether you can disseminate blueprints for a weapon that you're able to make through traditional manufacturing methods. So the question is really, well, if it's 3D printable, does that change that blueprint in some way? But basically, he was wrong when he said that the blueprints are for an entire AR-15. Defense Distributed did make available some blueprints for an AR-15, but they're not 3D printable blueprints. They're the same blueprints that you might use to make an AR-15 using traditional manufacturing methods. Also, Cody Wilson had a CNC router, CNC machine, computer numerical control machine called the Ghost Runner. It's not a 3D printer. Many people think that was blocked by the injunction. It was not. However, when you buy the Ghost Runner, which costs about $1,500, it's used to make untraceable parts of weapons. Not undetectable, they're made of metal, but they're untraceable because they have no serial number. This machine can make any kind of a metal part at all, not just gun parts, any kind at all. So that was not blocked, but it was delivered with a USB drive that contained those digital blueprints, and those, and so the USB drive dissemination was blocked. I've also read in the media that the State Department conceded that there was a First Amendment violation when it originally told Cody Wilson to take down the blueprints. That's not true. The settlement says specifically that the parties are not taking any position on that. So the State Department has not conceded a First Amendment violation. I mentioned before, though, that the Seattle court assumed there was a First Amendment violation, but the State Department has not conceded it. Some other misinformation. Pennsylvania Attorney General said, left unchecked, Americans would be able to download a wide range of actual working guns, including AR-15s, and 3D print their own guns without serial numbers and without being subjected to background check system for gun sales currently in place under federal and state laws through licensed firearm dealers. Now, this is partly true. You would be able, if you can print them at all, you can print them without serial numbers and without background checks. But as I mentioned before, complete AR-15s can't be 3D printed. Also, downloads of digital blueprints, it cannot be checked. And 3D printing of weapons, that can't be checked either. I'll explain why in a few minutes. Another piece of misinformation. Washington State Attorney General said in the complaint in the Seattle federal lawsuit that after 3D printed weapons blueprints are online, quote, the bell cannot be unrung. Well, that bell, as I have been explaining, and as I'll explain more as we go on, that bell started ringing in 2012, and it has been ringing ever since. Another piece of misinformation. The news reported after the August 27th injunction that Defense Distributed is selling the blueprints, still selling the blueprints in violation of the injunction. That is not true. In fact, the court's injunction issued on August 27th, it says, this is what it says regulation under the law, that's the law that controls ITAR. Regulation under the AECA means that the files cannot be uploaded to the internet, but they can be emailed, mailed, securely transmitted, or otherwise published within the United States. So it's perfectly legal for Defense Distributed to advertise these digital blueprints online. They can't post the digital blueprints online, but they can advertise them, and then they can deliver them by email or by mail or in some other secure way in the United States. So Defense Distributed is not selling these blueprints in violation of the injunction. They are selling them, but it is not in violation of the injunction. Another piece of misinformation. Washington Attorney General said after the injunction issued, it's a complete and total victory. This is totally wrong because, one, the injunction isn't based on the merits of the case. It's just to keep the status quo until there's a trial. The Ninth Circuit, as I mentioned before, could reverse, and the states could lose at the trial, which I think they will. But more importantly than any of the law is really beside the point here, is that in 2012, these blueprints were since 2012, these blueprints have been downloaded well over 100,000 times. They've been widely shared since then by the people who downloaded them. And then between the time they were reposted on July 27th to the date of the second takedown, which was early August, they were downloaded an unknown number of thousands of times. And all of this dissemination and proliferation of these blueprints, it can't be recalled or stopped. And as I mentioned before, the blueprints are still available on code-as-freespeech.com. They're there today. And they've always been there on other websites on the internet, and they're also on the dark web. And as I mentioned, it's perfectly legal for Defense Distributed to keep selling these things as long as they mail them. They don't actually post them online. And also, maybe the biggest reason why this injunction was not a total victory is because these lawsuits don't affect any other posts done by anybody else since 2012 of guns and components and accessories that I'll show you, and the blueprints for those things. Now, last bits of misinformation. Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, he said that this online site, meaning the Defense Distributed site, shows you how at your home with a simple 3D printer, you can make a plastic AR-15, an AR-10, a very dangerous semi-automatic assault weapon out of plastic in your own basement. Totally wrong. You can make the lower receiver, the grips, the magazine, but you cannot make the barrel firing mechanism out of plastic. He also said 3D printers are miraculous technology that has the potential to revolutionize manufacturing, but we need to make sure they are not being used to make deadly, undetectable weapons. Well, he's right that this is miraculous technology, and it's already revolutionizing manufacturing and bringing jobs back to the United States. But it's impossible to prevent 3D printers from making guns. You can make it illegal to do so. Whether that would be constitutional or not, that's a separate question, but it's impossible to prevent 3D printers from making guns. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is that 3D printers remove all of the entry barriers to manufacturing. It makes it possible for anyone to manufacture, and this democratizes manufacturing. Now, if you take this out of this guns realm, this is a great thing. It makes it possible for people to compete in manufacturing where they couldn't compete before. But there's a consequence to this, and this is something that I call away from control. I've written a lot about this. I talk a lot about it in my book. I've written many other articles on it, and I've talked about it on YouTube videos. And away from control means the ability to make things without anyone knowing about it, without anyone being able to control it. Think about that. Without anyone knowing about it, without anyone being able to control it. And to do this, you need digital blueprints, and that's what this whole thing is about. Now, as the democratization of manufacturing increases through the use of 3D printers, the ability to make things away from control, that increases as well. And it results in what I call the 5 I's. The 5 I's, first, you have an increased amount of illegal activity because of the democratization of manufacturing. If everybody can make things, well, then more bad guys can make things. And because these things are being done away from control, it's difficult to identify. If you can't identify it, then it's impractical or impossible to enforce the laws. And at that point, the laws become irrelevant. They still exist, they're on the books, they're just useless unless somebody just happens to get caught violating the law. Now let's talk a little bit about what I've been saying from the beginning, and that is that Cody Wilson was not alone, and his work in 3D printing of weapons, although it was pioneering, it's been far eclipsed by other people, and not just guns. He said, Cody Wilson said, on August 1st, 2018, that's the day when he would have been allowed to repost these blueprints based on the settlement with the State Department. On August 1st, the age of the downloadable gun formally begins. Well, actually, that age began in 2012. As I've mentioned, the blueprints have been on the World Wide Web this whole time. They've been on the dark web this whole time. And here's something important. Almost all of this work is anonymous. A mistake, if it's a mistake, Cody Wilson wanted people to know what he was doing and who he was. But, everybody else who's working in this area, they're anonymous. They don't tell you who they are. They wear gloves in the videos. You can't even see their hands in case. I think they're afraid people could pick up their fingerprints somehow if they enlarge the videos. So it's all anonymous. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we only know what we know. I know of people who've done very sophisticated work in the 3D printing weapons. They just don't put it online. They share it with their friends. They share it with people who do the same type of thing. They just don't post it out there for the world to see. There's a lot of this being done and some really sophisticated stuff. Actually, one guy who's doing it before Cody Wilson was doing it, but he didn't want publicity. October 2013, the digital blueprints for bump fire stock became available online. No one, including me, had ever heard of a bump fire stock until the Las Vegas massacre in October of last year. But the digital blueprints for making a bump fire stock were available in October 2013. There was a video from early 2017 of the test fire using a 3D printed bump fire stock. That was available on YouTube. I don't know if it still is. November 2013, a company 3D printed this metal replica of a Browning, 1911 Browning pistol. There's not a lot of these. They cost about $12,000 a piece. I've held this pistol in my hand. It's a beautiful piece of work. It was made by a fully licensed, the company had a firearms manufacturing license. And this is just to show you that the technology can take the 3D printing of weapons far beyond plastic weapons, but you have to have the right equipment. February of 2014, this is a year after, well, 2 years actually, after a year and a half actually, after Cody Wilson posted his blueprints. A guy in Japan 3D printed this revolver. It was the first revolver, 3D printed revolver, called a Zigzag. Because it's illegal to have weapons in Japan, he went to jail for 2 years for 3D printing this weapon and posting videos on how to make it online. And although I don't think he posted blueprints, does it matter? I mean, when you see these weapons, if you have any knowledge or skill in the use of 3D design software, anybody could do this. You don't need Defense Distributors blueprints. You don't need the Zigzag blueprints. You can make your own very easily. April 2015, this metal suppressor was made by an unknown person using a metal 3D printer. Pretty expensive machine was used here. Nobody knows who did it, but they took the design for a traditional suppressor and they twisted it to make it more artistic looking, and they printed this out in metal. April 2015. October 2015, an anonymous person who calls himself, and it was a guy, NSA Listbot, that's what he calls himself. He 3D printed this railgun, and most of the components were 3D printed. It fires these little projectiles. See, he's wearing gloves. No one can see his fingerprint. He's wearing a glove here, and he's holding in his hand a couple of the 3D printed projectiles. They can be printed in copper and Teflon, and they fire at about 560 miles per hour. This is the most sophisticated weapon I've seen that's been published. A guy named Durwood, that's it's a pseudonym. He made this gun called the Shooty, semi-automatic. You can see the components there. Most of them are plastic. They were 3D printed. Not all of them are. Some of them are metal. And this weapon is semi-automatic, and it fired in its test firing, fired 800 rounds before failing. And then he later upgraded that weapon, made it more resilient. And again, this was all done anonymously. Initially, Durwood said he was not publishing the digital blueprints online. I think they did become available online. Then in August of 2016, the TSA found this 3D printed revolver in carry-on luggage in the Reno Tahoe airport. It was fully loaded, and they found it. Even though the weapon itself might not have been detectable, except for the firing pin, it was fully loaded. So they found it going through the metal detector at the airport, and they seized it. The owner just gave it up, and there was nothing else published about it. I thought it was very strange. There was very little information. I wondered whether it might have been a test that worked. And then in September 2016, there's one of these anonymous makers out there who calls himself Guy in a Garage, and he made this gun, which is he calls the Songbird. It uses those rubber bands there. It's very much like the weapon that was in the movie The Line of Fire with John Malkovich and Clint Eastwood. Very much like that weapon, except it has interchangeable barrels and some metal parts. And it fires 357 rounds. And then finally, here's just a few more other accessories. Cody Wilson got in huge legal trouble because of his posting of the digital blueprints for an AR-10 lower receiver, Well, guy in the garage made the lower receiver on the AR-15 in the upper right-hand corner. So there's plenty of other people who've been 3D printing lower receivers and posting the digital blueprints online. They just don't get any press, and nobody knows who they are because they're anonymous. Upper left, 9mm ammunition, 3D printed. Lower left, this is a plastic silencer. I showed you a metal one, but they've also been done in plastic as well. In the lower right, shotgun shells, 3D printed shotgun shells, and the teenager who makes them. He's less than 18 years old. He goes under a pseudonym. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of misinformation out there about 3D printed weapons. My view is that it's impossible to prevent 3D printers from 3D printing weapons. It's impossible to stop the dissemination of digital blueprints for 3D printable weapons. You can have all the court decisions and all the laws and all the regulations you want. It won't stop this. It can be used as a mechanism for punishment if someone happens to get caught. But you have to ask, for example, there's laws that are being enacted right now to ban the sale or the 3D printing. I'm sorry, the sale, not the 3D printing. There's laws to ban the sale of bump fire stocks. Well, do you think that law would have stopped the Las Vegas shooter from 3D printing a bump fire stock if he knew he could? Actually, right after the laws, they started talking about laws to ban bump fire stocks, there's an online movement to make sure that those 3D printable digital blueprints for bump fire stocks, to make sure they got widely disseminated before they were banned. The defense distributed CAT is out of the bag. Those blueprints are out there, they're widely disseminated, they've always been available, and they can't be put back in the bag. And as I've shown you, there are many other CATs. They don't get publicity. Thank you for your time. Be glad to try to answer any questions. I go into a lot of these topics, especially the away from control topic, in a lot more detail in my book. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Nice. So thank you, John, for that amazing overview of what has happened and the amount of misinformation I guess there is. So it's really great to understand what's really going on. So we have about 19 people who've joined us, and of course there are others who are viewing us live on YouTube and Facebook. So all the attendees, please use the chat to post any questions, and then we will we will put them to John. And we also have another faculty who's signed on, Joe Bradley, who's also worked with us. And he's worked in engineering and business, so he's also here. I'll see if he has a question. But while our viewers type up any questions, Eric, over to you.
Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for showing. Great job as always, John.
Thank you.
As always, John. I think you've answered a lot of my questions here. So, is it right to say at this point? I guess I was a bit unsure at the end. Some of the examples that you showed, because at the beginning you said 3D printed gun is not undetectable because you need the firing pin being out of metal. But you showed us a gun, I think, that didn't have any metal components.
No, I think they all did. I think the Zigzag had a metal firing pin, and the Shooty definitely had metal parts, some springs, and the one at the end there, the Songbird, I believe that has a metal firing pin as well. So I believe all of them are detectable.
Okay, because being in the 3D printing space, John, that we get a lot of questions about this topic.
I'm sure you do.
I think one of the concerns is, the chief concerns is that the perception that they can't be detected, and when they sneak onto an airplane. Yeah. So at this point, given our current technology at airports, for example, do you think that is a credible threat?
Well, interesting question. Although they all have they all have a metal firing pin, and some of them have other metal parts as well. If it's just a firing pin that's metal, you could probably remove that, go through security, and then install it when you get on the plane. I don't think I'm giving anybody any ideas. It seems pretty obvious to me. But TSA recently came out with a public statement saying that they're not worried about this. They say that they have protocols and procedures in place. They've detected several 3D printed weapons already. The only one I know about is that revolver that I showed you. I don't think they've published information on the others, or at least it hasn't made into the media where I picked it up. So are they really undetectable? Well, possibly. Does that mean TSA won't pick them up? It's possible that they will. Could someone get a weapon onto a plane without it being detected? I think that is possible. I think that's probably possible with conventional weapons as well. So is there any greater threat than there was before? I don't see a greater threat. And remember, 9/11 wasn't done with guns. 9/11 was done with knives.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And just one related question. I believe that the issue with making your own guns, especially with the 3D printer, may be different across different countries. And we know with our Coursera audience, only about 20% come from the United States.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert on this topic like you are, John, but my perception of the U.S. is kind of unique in terms of the access to firearms and the dissemination of firearms. Because I've heard statistics that in this country, there are more guns than people. But if you go to another country like Japan or Korea or some other places that have tighter gun laws, I could see this perhaps being a much greater concern.
Yes. I've heard the statistic too, that there are more guns than people in the US. I don't know one way or the other about that. The Swiss love their guns. Swiss have guns like we do. But Australia, for example, it's illegal to have any guns, and there have been some 3D printing of guns there that, guns were already illegal. So making the digital blueprints was a new thing that they made illegal. Japan, same thing. I mentioned Japan before. So yes, you're right. I mean, the gun laws are much stricter in many other places around the world. Guns may already be illegal. Then that raises the new issue of the dissemination of digital blueprints. And that's something that countries are now taking up because they didn't have to worry about it so much before. Now it's an issue.
Great.
I think, John, just to sort of pick one on, you said the greater threat perhaps is that these are untraceable and, cannot be regulated and it's impractical. Because when I was reading about, what Cody Wilson and their associated, organization were doing, it came up that, they were also selling essentially a CNC machine, which could be used to fabricate other parts. So given the fact that, these designs as blueprints, as you call them, are now out in the open. And of course, our focus has been on 3D printing, but really a lot of the other, fabrication techniques, which are getting cheaper, more accessible. I think these guys were selling their CNC machine for $5,000 to $6,000, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I think I said, I think it sold for $1,500 and 6,000 have been sold. It could be the other way around. I'm pretty sure it was $1,500, 6,000 sold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I mean, that might be the bigger issue here with the ease of fabrication and untraceability. Yeah.
Right. Well, as I've said before, it's perfectly legal to make weapons in the United States. So, now question is, well, is the way that you make them going to be made regulated in some way? The Ghost Runner is the CNC machine you're talking about. I showed a photo of it. And the Ghost Runner is intended, yes, the specific intention of defense distributors that would be used to be making metal parts for weapons that are untraceable, so no serial numbers. But you can do that anyway without that machine, and you can't really control or ban that machine because that machine isn't any different from any other metal CNC mill. It can make any kind of a part, any kind at all. It's just that if you plug in the blueprints, the digital blueprints for making a firearm part, that's what it's going to make. And there are plenty of other CNC machines out there, and so that machine, yes, it can be used for that purpose, but can you ban it or control it? Not really, because it's just there are many other machines that do the same thing. They just don't market them
Yeah.
to make untraceable weapon parts.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
About marketing, really.
Yeah.
Not my fault. Do we have any questions from our viewers? So we have,
I'm looking at the chat. I don't.
Josh here, Luis is here,
Yeah,
Guatemala.
so we have folks from all over the world here. I don't see any questions. So I guess.
I have one more question, if maybe
Yeah.
you get a chance to chime in, or our time is short. So I noticed a bit of a paradox. I'm alone if you notice this as well, that it seems that the same folks who didn't believe 3D printing would do anything, that it was good for nothing making trinkets, those same people seem very concerned about 3D printers making guns. And so I don't know if that's something you've noticed as well, but if so, why is that? Why have guns captured so many people's imaginations? And people have to focus on all the great things that 3D printers have been doing, all the way from airplane parts to, for companies like Boeing, to prosthetics for children in developing countries. Why is this happening?
Well, I think this is just something that happens with new technology. People fear it. And a great analogy is to the early days of radio. When radio was first invented, there was actually some talk and some movements about to try to ban radio because they were afraid that it could be used to set off bombs remotely. And, that's being done, it has been done, but imagine if we banned radio. So people, I think, naturally fear new technology, but you're right. I mean, 3D printing is being used for great things. It is revolutionizing manufacturing. And I don't say it will, I say it is revolutionizing manufacturing. It is already bringing jobs back to America and creating new jobs. And it's great because it's democratizing manufacturing. It enables small companies to compete with big guys. But, as with any technology, it has its drawbacks. And it's just something that we have to regulate as well as we can. I mean, I'm not saying don't make the use of a 3D printer to make a weapon which is later used in a crime. I'm not saying don't make that illegal. I can't say make it illegal to use 3D printers to make weapons. It's perfectly legal to make weapons in this country, but I can say it's okay to make it illegal to use a printer to make a weapon that's then used in a crime. That's how the laws should be. And that way, if somebody uses it and gets caught, then they can be punished. I would never advocate getting rid of laws against murder, right? We have to have those laws. It doesn't stop people from murdering people, but it provides a mechanism for punishment if it ever happens. So that's, I think, the way the laws ought to be written here. And public education is very important because it's very easy for this misinformation to get out there, and then it's very easy for people to panic, like people who are in positions of authority or who can create laws. And if they panic without knowing the facts, they can enact laws that just don't make any sense at all, or that will somehow stifle the development of the technology that could take away all the great benefits that 3D printing offers.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I think we're probably close to the end of the hour, right, Vishal?
Yes, we are. So we'll of course, we'll share a recording of the webinar with all our learners on Coursera as well, and on Facebook and YouTube on our channels. I've just put John's Twitter handle and our 3D printing profs handle, and Eric and mine too. So if you want to follow along, learn more, I think John publishes a nice daily or a weekly post on what's interesting in 3D printing. I always find that very informative to keep up to date with what's new. So thank you, John.
I tweet daily on the most interesting thing I've seen.
The daily, yeah. So that's a good thing to sort of keep track of, because you travel a lot and you speak a lot. So it's good to gain from your experience. So thank you all. I think on the chat, people really liked it. They're all thanking you for the talk as well. And we appreciate the time you take to interact with our learners. And hope to catch you some other time when there are some more developments in this space.
Well, anytime, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. And thank you to all the attendees. And Eric, thank you for helping co-host. We'll see you all next time.
Happy 3D printing.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.